Hope everybody's doing well. I'm going to read another chapter of The Witches. This is called How to Recognize a Witch. Alright, here we go. The next evening, after Grandmother had given me a bath, she took me once again into the living room for another story. Tonight, your old grandma said, the old woman said, I'm going to tell you how to recognize a witch when you see one. Can you always be sure? I asked. No, she said, you can't, and that's the trouble. You can make a pretty good guess. She was dropping cigar ashes all over her lap, and I hoped she wasn't going to catch on fire before she told me how to recognize a witch. In the first place, she said, a real witch is certain to always be wearing gloves when you meet her. Surely not always, I said. What about in the summer when it's hot? Even in the summer, my grandmother said. She has to. Do you want to know why? Why, I said. Because she doesn't have fingernails. Instead of fingernails, she has thin, curvy claws like a cat, and she always wears gloves to hide them. Mind you, lots of respectable women wear gloves, especially in the winter, so this doesn't help you very much. Mama used to wear gloves, I said. Not in the house, my grandmother said. Witches wear gloves even in the house. They only take them off when they go to bed. How do you know all this, Grandmama? Don't interrupt, she said. Just take it all in. The second thing to remember is that the real witch is always bald. Bald, I said. Bald is a boiled egg, my grandmother said. I was shocked. There was something indecent about a bald woman. Why are they bald, Grandmama? Don't ask me why, she snapped, but you can take it from me that not a single hair grows on a witch's head. How horrid. Disgusting, my grandmother said. If she's bald, she'll be easy to spot, I said. Not at all, my grandmother said. A real witch always wears a wig to hide her baldness. She wears first-class wig, and it is almost impossible to tell a really first-class wig from an ordinary hair unless you give it a pull and see if it comes off. Then that's what I'll have to do, I said. Don't be foolish, my grandmother said. You can't go around pulling on the hair of every lady you meet, even if she's wearing gloves. You just try it and see what happens. That doesn't help very much either, I said. None of these things is any good on its own, my grandmother said. It's only when you put them all together and they begin to make a little sense. Mind you, my grandmother went on, these wigs do cause rather serious problem for witches. What problem, Grandmama? They make the scalp itch most terribly, she said. You see, when an actress wears a wig, or if you or I were to wear a wig, we would be putting it on our own hair. But a witch has to put it straight on her naked scalp. And underneath a wig is always very rough and scratchy. It sets up a frightful itch and on the bald skin. It causes nasty sores on the head. Wig rash in the witches all call it. And it doesn't half itch. What's the other thing I must look for to recognize a witch? I asked. Look for the nose holes, my grandmother said. Witches have slightly larger nose holes than ordinary people. The rim of each nose hole is pink and curvy, like a rim of a certain kind of seashell. Why do they have such big nose holes, I asked. For smelling with, my grandmother said. A real witch has the most amazing powers of smell. She can actually smell out a child who is standing on the other side of the street in the pitch black night. She couldn't smell me, I said. I just had a bath. Oh, yes, she could, my grandmother said. The cleaning you happen to be the most smelly you are to a witch. That can't be true, I said. An absolutely clean child gives off the most ghastly stench to a witch, my grandmother said. The dirtier you are, the less you smell. But that doesn't make sense, Grandmama. Oh, yes, it does, my grandmother said. It isn't the dirt that the witch is smelling, it's you. The smell that drives a witch mad actually comes right out of her own skin. It comes oozing out of your skin in waves, and those waves stink waves, and the witches call them, go floating through the air and hit the witch right smack in the nostrils. They send her reeling. Now wait a minute, Grandmama. Don't interrupt, she said. The point of this is, when you haven't washed for a week, your skin is all covered over the dirt. Then quite obviously of stinking waves cannot come oozing out nearly as strongly. I shall never have a bath again, I said. But, I said, just don't have one too often, my grandmother said. Once a month is quite enough for the sensible child. It was a moments like these that I loved my grandmother more than ever. Grandmama, I said, if it's dark night, how can a witch smell the difference between a child and a grown-up? Because grown-ups don't give out stink waves, she said. Only children do that. But I don't really give out stink waves, do I? I said, I'm not giving them out at this very moment, am I? Not to me, you aren't, my grandmother said. To me, you're smelling like raspberries and cream. But to a witch, you would smell absolutely disgusting. What would I be smelling of? Dog's droppings, my grandmother said. I reeled. I was stunned. Dog droppings? I cried. I'm not smelling of dog droppings. I don't believe it. I won't believe it. What's more, my grandmother said, speaking with a touch of relish, to a witch, you'd be smelling of fresh dog's droppings. That simply is not true, I cried. I know I am not smelling of dog droppings, stale or fresh. There's no point in arguing about it, my grandmother said. It's a fact of life. I was outraged. I simply couldn't bring myself to believe that my grandmother was telling me. So, if you see a woman holding her nose as if she passes you in the street, and she went on, that woman could easily be a witch. I decided to change the subject. Tell me what else to look for in a witch, I said. The eyes, my grandmother said. Look carefully in the eyes, because the eyes are the real witch of the different from your eyes and mine. Look in the middle of each eye where there's normally a little black dot. If she is a witch, the black dot will keep changing color, and you will see fire and you will see ice dancing right in the very center of the colored dot. I will send shivers running all over your skin. My grandmother leant back in her chair and sucked away contently on her flower black cigar. I squatted on the floor, staring up at her in fascination. She was not smiling. She looked deadly serious. So there's a picture of him and his grandmother talking. Are there other things? I asked her. Of course there were other things, my grandmother said. You don't seem to understand that witches are not actually women at all. They look like women. They talk like women, and they are able to act like a woman, but in actual fact, they are totally different animals. They are demons in human shape. That is why we have claws and bald heads and queer noses and peculiar eyes, all of which they have conceal as best they can from the rest of the world. What else is different about them, Grandmama? The feet, she said. Witches never have toes. No toes, I cried. Then what do they have? They just have feet, my grandmother said. The feet have square ends with no toes on them at all. Does that make it difficult to walk? I asked. Not at all, my grandmother said, but it does give them a problem with their shoes. All ladies like to wear small, rather pointed shoes, but a witch whose feet are very wide and square at the ends are almost awful job squeezing her feet into those neat little pointed shoes. Why doesn't she wear wide, comfy shoes with the square ends? I asked. She dare not, my grandmother said. Just as she hides her baldness with a wig, she must also hide her ugly witch feet by squeezing them into pretty shoes. Isn't that terribly uncomfortable? I said. Extremely uncomfortable, my grandmother said. But she has to put it up with it. If she's wearing ordinary shoes, it won't help me to recognize her, will it, Grandma? I'm afraid it won't, my grandmother said. You might possibly see limping very softly, but only if you watch closely. Are those the only difference then, Grandmama? There, one more, my grandmother said. Just one more. What is it, Grandmama? Their spit is blue. Blue, I cried. Not blue. Their spit can't be blue. Blue as a bilberry. She said. You don't mean it, Grandmama. Nobody can have blue spit. Witches can, she said. Is it like ink? I said. Exactly, she said. They even use it to write with. They use those old-fashioned pens that have nibs and I simply licked the nib. Can you notice a blue spit? Grandmama, if a witch was talking to me, would I be able to notice it? Only if you look carefully, my grandmother said. If you look very carefully, you would. And there's a picture of the witch. Probably see a bluish image tinge to her teeth, but it doesn't show much. If it would if she spat, I said. Witches never spit, my grandmother said. They daren't. I couldn't believe my grandmother would be lying to me. She went to church every morning of the week, and she said grace before every meal, and everybody who did it would never tell lies. I was beginning to believe every word she spoke. So there you are, my grandmother, she said. That's about all I can tell you. None of it is very helpful. You can still never be absolutely sure whether a woman is a witch or not just by looking at her. But if she was wearing gloves, if she has large nose holes, queer eyes, or her hair looks as though it might be a wig, and if she has bluish tinge to her teeth, if she has all of these things, then you run like mad. Grandmama, I said, when you were little girl, did you ever meet a witch? Once, my grandmother said. Only once. What happened? I'm not going to tell you, she said. It would frighten you out of your skin and give you bad dreams. Please tell me, I begged. No, she said. Certain things are too horrible to talk about. Does it have something to do with your missing thumb, I asked. Suddenly, her old wrinkled lips shut tight as a pair of tongs, and her hand that held a cigar, which was no thumb on it, began to quiver very slightly. I waited. She looked at me. She didn't speak. All of a sudden, she had shut herself off completely. The conversation was finished. Good night, Grandma, I said, raising from the floor, kissing her on the cheek. She didn't move. I crept out of the room and went to my bedroom. That's that chapter. Tomorrow we will read The Grand High Witch. All right. I hope you're all doing well. I miss you. Mwah.